Let's go. The threats are pawn takes pawn.
There are no checks in this position.
The best move in puzzle position is pawn takes pawn. Bishop to d2. Bishop to d6. Bishop to e1.
f4.
Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position.
Here are the checks. c4
Check. Answer to this puzzle is
c4
check. King to c6.
a4.
Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Rook takes bishop.
Checks in this position are
Queen to h7 check. Queen to h8 check. The answer is rook takes bishop. Rook to b8. Rook to c1. Queen to d3. Rook takes rook.
Another puzzle.
Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn.
Checks in this position are
Rook takes rook check. Queen to g1 check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes rook check. King to h2. Queen to e5 check.
g3.
King to g8. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn.
There are no checks in this position.
Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to f8. King to b3. Rook takes pawn check. Rook to c3.
b4.
King to c2. King to d4. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook.
b6. f2. Another puzzle.
The threats are queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn.
There are no checks in this position.
Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to e1.
a5.
Queen to a3. Queen to d1. Knight takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position.
Checks in puzzle position are.
Knight to g6 check. Knight to f3 check. The answer is
f7.
King to h3. King to g6.
Another puzzle.
Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn. King takes rook.
There are no checks in this position.
The best move in puzzle position is king takes rook. King takes pawn. Rook to g1. King to h4. Rook to a1.
b2.
Rook takes pawn check.
Another puzzle.
Here are the threats. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn check. Queen takes pawn check. Queen takes bishop check.
Let us look at checks in puzzle position.
Queen takes pawn check. Queen to f2 check. Queen takes pawn check. Queen to f1 check. Queen takes bishop check. The answer is queen takes pawn check. King to h1. Queen takes rook. Queen to e5 check. King to g8. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. There are no threats in this position.
There are no checks in this position.
Answer to this puzzle is king to d6. King takes pawn.
b5.
Pawn takes pawn.
b6.
King to f7. King takes pawn. King to e7. King to c4. King to d7. King takes pawn. King to c6. King to a5. Let's continue. The threats are king takes pawn. Rook takes pawn.
There are no checks in this position.
The answer is rook takes pawn. Rook to c7. Bishop to f7. Rook takes bishop. King takes rook. Another one. Threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position.
There are no checks in this position.
Solution to the puzzle is king to c4.
f4. a4. b4. a5. h5.
a6. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes rook check.
Checks in puzzle position are.
Rook takes rook check. The best move in puzzle position is
g4.
Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook check. King to g7.
f3.
Next, here are the threats. Queen takes pawn check. Queen takes knight.
Checks in puzzle position are.
Queen takes pawn check. Queen to h6 check. Queen to h4, check. Rook to h3, check. The answer is rook to h3, check. King to g8. Queen to f6. Knight to f3, check. Pawn takes knight. Rook to d1, check. King to g2. Queen to g7. Queen to e7. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes pawn.
Here are checks in puzzle position.
Queen to c5, check. The puzzle is solved using Queen to c5, check. King to f7. Rook to e3. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop.
Checks in puzzle position are
Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes bishop. Pawn takes rook. Knight to e5. Queen to h3. Knight to f3, check. Another one.
Let us look at threats in puzzle position.
Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes knight. Rook takes knight.
There are no checks in this position.
The puzzle is solved using rook to b1. Queen to c3. Knight takes pawn. Knight to d2. Queen to h5. g6. Queen to h4. Knight takes rook. Knight takes queen.
Another puzzle.
Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn.
Here are the checks.
Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to e4. Queen to f6. Queen to c4. Queen to f2. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes bishop.
Let us look at checks in puzzle position.
Rook to f1, check. The answer is bishop to f3. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn.
Let us look at checks in puzzle position.
Queen to h6, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. The best move in puzzle position is
e5.
Pawn takes pawn. Queen to h6, check. King to g8. Rook to g1. Bishop to e8. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are there are no threats in this position.
There are no checks in this position.
The puzzle is solved using king to f3. Rook to e1. King to f2. Rook to b1.
f3.
Promotes to queen. Rook takes queen. Another one.
Let us look at threats in puzzle position.
Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn.
There are no checks in this position.
The answer is c6.
e5.
d7. Bishop to e6. Rook takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn.
Checks in this position are
rook to h7, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen to e8, check. Queen to g8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to f7. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen to g5. Rook to f5. Next, here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. King takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn.
Checks in this position are
Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight takes pawn. King to g1. Knight to f3, check. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Queen to d3. Rook to d8. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn.
There are no checks in this position.
The best move in puzzle position is
h3. e5.
Queen takes pawn.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.